it's not very often that you actually get to introduce a movie that you appear in. So it's sort of a pleasure to do that tonight. When Deborah Coons-Garcia was making this movie, she gave me a call because she had read my book Dirt, and she wanted to talk about make the idea of making a movie about soils. And so I was, I think, the first person that she interviewed for it, and found out I knew of her movie, The Future of Food, which if you haven't seen that, it's a fabulous movie. You know, get it, watch it. You're obviously going to watch Symphony of the Soil tonight, so I don't have to recommend that to you. Definitely stay. So I was really excited when she got a hold of me. She came up to Seattle, we started talking, and learned that she's just this absolutely fabulous human being. She's a wonderful person, a wonderful filmmaker. You're in for a real treat tonight. I had not really thought that somebody could make a visually stimulating, beautiful, intellectually engaging movie about soil, but she did it. It was hard enough to write a book about dirt, which you are not supposed to call soil, which is obviously why I called my book about soil Dirt, because I'm not very good at taking direction. But so Deborah came up, filmed for a day. We went out to Snohomish River, went out to film on some farms, filmed in my office, talked about stuff, brainstormed, had a barbecue, and then I kind of forgot about it. 3 years later then, she gets back in touch with me and she's finished the movie. So 3 hours is like a wonderful amount of time to put into a movie. I think it took 3 years to put this thing together. She traveled all over the world. And what really most impressed me wasn't the artistic beauty that you'll see in the movie, because I kind of expected that, having seen The Future of Food. She's a good filmmaker, damn good filmmaker. What really impressed me, though, was how well she did her homework. She really went and talked to the people that if you were going to make a movie about soils, how important they are, how they work, how they have helped sustain civilizations, she kind of went through the characters that you really should talk to. And when I finally saw the sort of what she had put together over the course of a couple of years after we had met, I was really very, very much impressed. So I'll just gush. I could just gush about the movie a lot. I'll stop on that now because you're here, you're going to see it, you're in for a treat. Tell everyone you know to get it and see it. Why would I argue that? Well, one of the reasons that I, a geologist, wrote a book about soils and how their importance to civilizations is that soils really are the most underappreciated yet most valuable resource that humanity has. If you think about the way a geologist does, that 100 years is kind of a blink of an eye in the time scale of the planet or of a civilization, you start to appreciate how important soils are in the maintenance of civilization. And the thesis of my Dirt book was essentially that the longevity of human societies, how long a society can last, is actually set by how well they treat their land, their agricultural land in particular. And ironically, in the way that ever since the invention of the plow, one of the things that has actually limited the longevity of society after society has been that erosion, the loss of soil, occurs faster on plowed land than soils naturally rebuild. But it occurs so slowly that we don't really notice it in our lifetimes. You can notice it as it integrates over multiple generations. But like a single farmer may only recognize the real damage being done to the land over the course of their whole life looking back. And I sort of found this time and time again in societies in the past. The rate of erosion, the rate of soil loss of fertile topsoil off of farm fields, exceeded the rate of soil production by orders of a millimeter or 2 or 5 millimeters per year. And your fingernails grow faster than that. It's not a very impressive number unless you're a geologist, unless you integrate it over centuries. And it turns out that if you basically take the kind of standard agricultural soil loss that you can get off of any kind of a plowed field, and you run that experiment for centuries, you can essentially burn through 1 foot to 3 feet of soil, which is about all anywhere on Earth is really naturally endowed with for the most part. And you can burn through that in the course of centuries. If you look back at the lifespan of most major agricultural civilizations, you're dealing with on the order of 1,000 years or two. About the time scale you'd predict if the longevity of societies was limited by how fast agricultural soils erode. And why do agricultural soils erode faster than soils form? Well, how many places have you been in the world, outside of the world's deserts, where you see a whole lot of bare soil on native terrain? You walk around the old growth out in the Olympic Peninsula, or even walk around town here, you don't see a whole lot of bare earth. And when you do, though, if you go by a construction site, some place where the ground has been disturbed and you get a rain, what color is the water that comes off of it? It's not blue, it's brown. That's basically topsoil bleeding away in real time. And to a geologist, you integrate that up over the course of centuries, and that's what essentially the classical way that we farmed, plow-based agriculture, can actually do to the landscape over time. And dirt was an attempt to essentially pull that story together and look at the evidence. The numbers pan out. I think that basically the history of humanity, in many ways, has been one of essentially mining soil, starting in the Middle East and then moving essentially through North Africa, southern Italy, Western Europe, onto the eastern seaboard of the US, throughout Asia, Easter Island, China. You can go down just the whole litany of society after society, and the story is actually fairly similar. Now, if you look today at sort of what the average rate of soil loss is on this planet, we sort of are losing soil at the rate of average of about 1 millimeter a year off of our topsoil. But we're also essentially paving soil over faster than it's forming. And if you look at the rate of soil loss globally, we're losing on the order of about 0.7%, just under 1% of the world's fertile topsoil every year at present, and have been for the last several decades. That's a small number, less than 1% a year. You know, that's kind of like how much you get on interest from a bank account these days. It's kind of like nothing. But you integrate that over 150 years, and it adds up to everything. So we're actually on course as a global society at present to erode through the very resource that we depend on to feed ourselves over the course of the next 100 years. Now, this next century is obviously going to be a very interesting place in terms of the confluence of environmental forces, in terms of climate change, human population growth. And if you think about the problem of feeding the world, sometime after 2050, a few decades from now, out towards the latter half of the 21st century, shooting towards 2100, if we basically lose another, say 50% of our topsoil while our population goes up by another 50%, we're actually going to have a very hard time producing enough food to feed everybody. That's not a problem today. We actually grow enough food on this planet to feed everybody a full caloric, to meet their caloric needs, if we manage to distribute it equitably around the world. I know we grow enough food to feed everybody today. The problem of global hunger is not one of production, it's one of distribution. You look out 50 years from now, and you could forecast that if we continue to lose agricultural land and the population keeps going up, then it will actually become a problem of production. And the issue will be who gets food and who doesn't get it, not who can afford it and who can't afford it. And if you look at the amount of soil we've lost since the Second World War, we've actually lost about a third of the global supply of topsoil in the last 50, 60, 70 years. An amount of land that's equivalent to the combined area of China and India is the amount of farmland that's been abandoned due to soil degradation over the last, well, essentially, the last half century or so. That obviously can't go on. It's not sustainable. What could we actually do to essentially try and turn that around? That's actually, I think, something that is eminently solvable. Turns out if you actually look at the problem of agriculture as one of essentially reinvesting in the soil and investing in soil fertility and the life of the soil, we could actually restore soils globally surprisingly fast. Why? Well, nature makes soils very slowly. The average rate of soil production in nature is less than about 1/10 of a millimeter a year. Incredibly slow. People can make soil much faster. How? By combining organic matter with mineral soil through composting, through the application of labor and recycling of organic matter. My wife, for example, took a lot in North Seattle where we just had a 90-year-old lawn. It was basically dead. There wasn't a worm living in it. It was literally, virtually sterile. And it was built on glacial till. Why was it that way? Well, essentially, when they built our house, they scraped off the topsoil that had built up over 6,000 years beneath an old-growth forest. Why? Well, because organic matter, good fertile soil, doesn't make good, doesn't hold a foundation well. So they scraped it clean, got it back to hard stuff, and then slapped a lawn and the rest of the lot. Well, Anne's a gardener, an organic gardener. She wasn't very happy with the soil that we had when we bought the house. Why did we buy North Seattle? Well, I teach at UW and it's walking distance, and that was as close as we could afford to buy. But over the course of about 8 years, through intensive composting and intensive essentially care for the soil, trying to bring it back to life, promoting the microbial life in the soil, bringing the soil back to life, we saw an explosion of plants in the yard that essentially produced more organic matter that we recycled back into the soil. Now, about a decade after we bought the place, the soil the organic matter content's gone up many percent, is basically exploding with life. And really illustrated to me the ability that we have as people to essentially create positive change in the environment and to restore soil in ways that actually have great sort of multiplying and add-on effects in terms of other life. I mean, the amount of bird life that's come back in our yard and insect life has been amazing. Those species aren't really used in the neighbors' yards. Places where essentially the soil's not alive. Why? Well, the food's in our lawn. We've got tons of espresso-charged worms running around our lawn. Why? Well, coffee grounds mixed with other things actually makes for very good organic matter sort of kickstarting the soils. So one of the things that Ann and I are working on now is a follow-up book to Dirt, the title of which is still yet to be determined. It would probably be something like The Hidden Half of Nature, that essentially goes into how life in the soil and microbial life, the kind of life we don't notice, the things we don't see every day, the stuff that's actually invisible to us because it's either below ground where we don't have X-ray eyes, or it's so small that we can't actually see it. Those life forms actually govern things like soil fertility, our own digestive system, our immune system. And many of the microbes that live in your gut are actually microbes that migrated into humanity along with the food that we picked up off of the floor of Africa, probably. And some of the species of microbes that you find in the soil that help the transfer of nutrients from breaking down minerals and then shuttling them into plant roots and getting them into plants. Some of those microbes are very similar in the descendants of some of the microbes that inhabit our bodies and actually help facilitate nutrient transfer and immune system function in people. There's this whole hidden half of nature that actually influences the way that we perceive the world, the way the world we know runs. And the reason to bring all that up is essentially that if we actually look at the world a little bit differently, if we look at, say, soils a little differently, look at it as a resource that's the foundation for terrestrial life, actually is driving life above ground, and we treat it as a valuable resource rather than essentially as dirt, something to be wasted, the cheapest input to the agricultural production process. If we look at it differently and treat it differently, if we look at the microbial fauna in our own bodies a little differently and treat it differently, change what we eat perhaps, you can actually generate surprising changes and deal with problems like the problem of soil fertility and feeding the world between the 2050 and 2100. A lot of what you're going to see in this movie tonight is essentially an exploration of what is soil, what is it good for, how have we changed the view of soil and its connection to microbial life, and why that's important. And why it's important is because we really are at a crossroads in history over in the next couple decades in the way we practice farming. The thing that we all depend on someone to do to feed us, that is going to change this century. Why is it going to change? Well, what's happening to oil this century? Does anybody here think that the price of oil is going to go down in the next 100 years? Nobody? No takers? I mean, I'm ready to make the bet. And we burn essentially 10 calories of oil to grow 1 calorie of food in this country, the kind of agriculture that we practice in the broadest sense. And so if we have agricultural practices that are fundamentally dependent on an input that's going to become increasingly rare and expensive, what do you think is going to happen? Other forces are going to come into play, and we're going to have to essentially change our practices. And we stand at sort of a crossroads of how we do that. There's been enough studies now that have come out that have shown that organic agriculture and sort of what is loosely called in the rubric of eco-agriculture these days, sort of not purely organic, but much more ecologically oriented and driven towards viewing the soil as an ecological system to be worked with rather than against. Those kinds of agriculture can outperform conventional agriculture over time, particularly in droughts. The droughts that I've been visiting farms in the Midwest over the last couple of years, and the great droughts that we've had there, some of the farms that have actually performed really well have been no-till and organic farms that kind of get comparable yields in sort of good years, but really hold their water well during bad years and radically outperformed some of the now conventional agrochemically dependent farms that were right next door. I think we're going to see, in other words, this century, a confluence of interests where the economic interests that are affecting individual farmers on the land are actually going to encourage them to adopt practices that are much more sustainable and in the interest of humanity over the long run. That could actually be a real sea change in the way that we view soils and treat land. So I encourage you, when you look at this movie tonight, which really is an exploration of the beauty and the role of soils in the world, from sort of a coupled science and art perspective, filtered through Deborah's wonderful eyes. Think about the next 100 years. Think about what the kind of choices that we're going to be facing as a species in the way that we actually grow our food and use our food. Think about the kinds of things you can do, the kinds of changes that you could make in your own yards. I was actually amazed when I ran the carbon budget numbers for our own house. We've put tons of carbon in our ground and in the vegetation that we've actually grown on a small lot in North Seattle. Now that hasn't offset our carbon footprint. Why? Well, because I fly way too much to actually throw any rocks about that one. But the point being is if every yard around Western Washington, or in Issaquah or in Seattle, actually increased the carbon content of their soil by just a couple percent, you're talking an awful lot of carbon that can be parked in the ground and not released into the atmosphere. So I don't want to dwell on too long about this movie or gush too much about Deborah's movie. I'll let you do that after you've seen it. And I'd be glad to entertain any questions that people have on them for me. I mean, I'm a geologist by training. I've written a book about fish, soil, and religion. So one of these days I'll get around to writing a book about geology. My editor's kind of bugging me about that now. But I'd be glad to entertain questions on those. I obviously recommend all three books to you. Check them out at the library if you don't want to support your favorite local author. Or if you have another one, right? But anyways, I'd be glad to entertain questions, and I don't want to stand in the way of the movie, because that's what you're really here to see.
Really quickly, do we have any questions?
I do have a brief question.
Okay.
I'm so thankful that you're here tonight. I really appreciate you coming. It's really awesome to have you join us. But we also have some high school students and some students in the audience, and I'm wondering if you can go back to when you were in high school and what set your path to your career in terms of the science background and where you are now.
Yeah, okay. Well, where I am now is teaching at the University of Washington,
Awesome.
Which was an accident, but I can tell you how I got there too. But essentially, the person that got me into science was a very particular biology teacher. She was just absolutely amazing. She taught AP biology where I was, and she got me into science by recognizing that I have a tendency to think outside the box. So she gave me questions to make me think outside the box, and I really liked that because my other teachers weren't doing it. So when I got the Macarthur Award a few years ago, which is one of the best surprises you can ever get, somebody calls you up randomly and offers you $500,000 for doing nothing. It's a really nice phone call. One of the first things I did is I called her and thanked her for getting me into science because she had an amazing influence on me. But the other thing I think I would suggest is that I think the best advice that I forgot that I ever gave to somebody that they then came back and thanked me for giving them was someone who asked me sort of for career advice sort of out of college. And I basically said, well, do what you really love doing. Because life is too short to be doing something that you don't really love. And what I've seen in a lot of my colleagues is that if you really enjoy what you're doing, so whether it's filmmaking or music or sustainability issues, if you're really into it, you'll probably excel at it, which means you'll be good at it and you'll go far in it. And so to me, sort of, sticking with your passion, doing what you love is some of the best advice you could ever get. Secondary piece of advice would be, trust in random chances. I mean, if I look back at my career, there's a series of choices that I made that ended up to where I'm at now that I never would have forecast the outcome of at the time. In fact, when I declared the geology major, I think I suspect that my parents were wondering how I was going to make a living. And I've never really worried about that. Things have a way of tending to work out if you do what you really love and you're good at it and you apply yourself well.
Thank you very much.
All right, fantastic. Thank you. And I think we're going to, we have another question.
Yes, that is conventional agriculture.
And can you estimate what the ratio would be for organic farming?
Oh, it depends how you do it. Because you can do oil-intensive organic agriculture, and you can do, a lot of the numbers come out of fertilizer use. So if you're not using the artificial nitrogen supplements, you could knock those numbers down. You could also do non-organic agriculture and cut those numbers way down. And so like no-till agriculture, where you don't plow so much, but you essentially plant through last year's crop stubble for row crops, for corn and wheat and things. You can cut the oil, direct oil bills by like a half to a third, because it simply takes fewer passes of vehicles over the land, but it's not organic. So it's sort of a complicated thing. The shortest answer in terms of how to go, I think, sort of less oil intensive would be smaller farms, because it's, you know, if you're farming 10,000 acres in Iowa, you're using big machines. And so if you really want to go low oil use, you're talking small scale labor intensive agriculture, which is going to be more appropriate for some parts of the world than others, or for some farms or some crops than others.
Great. Well, let's thank Dave Montgomery for coming tonight. Thank you very much. I wanted